So as leaders, you must retreat before you advance. You must reflect before you rebuild, and you must reset before you restart.
You're listening to the Simply Strategic Ministry podcast. Our goal is to help you grow your ministry through simple strategies and scalable systems.
Welcome to the Simply Strategic Ministry podcast, where our goal is to help church leaders grow their ministries through simple strategies and scalable systems. My name's Landon, and I am so excited and so honored that you join us here on episode 16 of the podcast. It's 2024. We're starting a brand new season of podcasts, and I cannot wait to really help you. And I really am honored that you join us here. But as always, I know you hear this on every single podcast you listen to, but if you could follow or subscribe, if you're watching on YouTube, or if you could like and leave a comment, that's going to help us. We're really going to try to invest a whole lot more into this podcast over the next year, and would love for you to help us spread the word and help us get this content into other leaders' hands. And so, doing this helps connect us with other strategic leaders so we can help them and we can hopefully make our leadership community even better. So I'm excited to jump in, so let's get started. So today we're going to talk about a conversation. We're going to begin a conversation on self-leadership. Now, we have spoke a lot about being a healthy leader in this last season. We talked about how healthy leaders have build healthy systems, and healthy systems build healthy leaders. And so today I want to talk about really how to strategically lead yourself. And I'm titling this podcast, How to Build a Rule of Life. And it's all about strategic self-leadership. So at SSM, we talk a lot about planning strategy. We talk a lot about communication strategy and volunteer strategy and the systems that accompany it. And those things are highly important. I believe they're incredibly important. But today, I want to speak to you on the most important person you will ever lead, and that is yourself. You know that old adage. And I have a confession to make, and I bet you have the same confession too. Is at the time of this recording, it's January 2024, and I just wrapped up a week where I did what's called the Year in Reset, which is a resource we're going to talk a ton about in this podcast. But I just wrapped up a week of reflecting on my last year and looking at the year behind me. And as I process the wins and I process the losses, the mistakes, and the lessons learned, I realized something. And I was a part of every bad decision I made. I made some bad decisions. I made some things that I regret. I praise God, I had no big moral failures, but there were definitely some unwise things that happened in 2023. And I was a part of every one of them. In fact, I wasn't just a part of every one of them. I was the deciding factor behind every one of them. I was deeply integrated into every bad decision I made. And here's the truth. You were a part of every bad decision you made as well. So we can dream, we can have vision, we can have ideas for a new year of ministry, and I hope that you do. But if we don't address the person leading the ministry, then we're going to miss out on what God has for us in this season. And so here's the problem that many of us face as we go into 2024. The problem that we face as we enter 24 is we probably have a volunteer recruiting system or an onboarding system or a training system. And we probably have a system for planning a sermon series. And we probably have a system for planning summer camp. Or we probably have a system for leadership development. And essentially, anything we value in our lives, we have some sort of system in place to ensure that those things are producing the results that we want. Everything that operates your life operates in some sort of a system. And so anything of value we put into a system. And if I were coming to your church to coach you and I asked you what your ministry systems are and what your processes were, I bet that you could probably get a whiteboard and draw those things out. You may not have it down in like a digital system with a workflow and all the different things that you could accompany your system, but I bet if you were to grab a whiteboard, you could show me, hey, this is how we run summer camp, this is how we plan things, this is how I write a sermon series. But if I asked you, what is your self-leadership system, what would you say? Could you draw it out on a sheet of paper? Could you write it down on a napkin? Could you whiteboard it for me? Could you list it out in processes? Do you have an app that helps you run it, like Asana, or do you have it all written out in a spreadsheet or a Google Drive somewhere? What's your self-leadership system? Because anything we value we put into a system so that we know that there's going to be predictable success, so that we know we are going to achieve the results that we want time and time again. So what is your self-leadership system? Could you walk me through the steps that keep you going or keep us going? And here's what I know. If something is important, we have a system for it, but most leaders do not have a self-leadership system. And so here's the question I want you and your team or whoever's listening to this to ask themselves, okay, is do we have a self-leadership system that produces the results we want to achieve? Because if you and if I was a part of every single good and bad decision that I made in 2023, then the most important person that you could lead is not a key volunteer. It's not your boss by leading up. It's not your spouse. It's you. See, Jordan Peterson, the Canadian psychologist who, everybody listens to on YouTube, is on every single podcast in the world. He talks about in his book, The 12 Rules for Life, which is like an antidote to chaos, he says. And he says this, and I think this antidote to chaos is also an antidote to chaos in your ministry. He says this rule. He says, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. We have all kinds of different adages of this, of like, don't throw rocks in a house made of glass, or, we got to look at our own foundation before we start looking at other people's foundations. Like we got to look at the speck in our own eye or the plank in our own eye before we look in the speck of others' eyes. And what he's saying basically is that before we can look out into the world, before we can look beyond ourselves, we have to make sure that the things that are in our own control are taken care of, are shepherded well, are self-led very well. And so a self-leadership system is what sets your own house in order. Before we step into a new year, I think with all these hopes for our ministry, we need to ask ourselves, do we have that? Do we have something that's setting our own house in order before we try to set other people's houses in order, or before we try to lead the house of God, or before we try to go out and tell the world and change the world for Jesus? See, here's the truth. We all want to lead beyond ourselves, but we must first start with a ruthless drive to lead ourselves. Let me say that again. We all want to lead beyond ourselves, but we must first start with a ruthless drive to lead ourselves. Now, this is a podcast for church leaders, and church leaders have this little shtick about them where they can say, oh, that's just self-help. And you might be thinking this sounds very self-helpy, but this is not an idea that I came up with. This is not an idea that Jordan Peterson came up with. This is honestly a very biblical value. For example, consider what Paul says to his friends in the church of Ephesus. He says this in Ephesians 5. And you probably heard this verse before, but he says, look carefully then how you walk. This is Ephesians 5, verse 15 through 21. Look carefully then at how you walk, not as unwise, but as wise, making the best use of time, because the days are evil. Therefore, do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. And do not get drunk with wine, for that is debauchery, but be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with your heart, giving thanks always and everything to God, the Father, in the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. So do you see what he's telling them to do? Like, look at verse 15 through 16. He says this. He says to look carefully at how you walk. And leaders, what we have to do, and this is something we have to do every single year, at every new season of our life, we have to look carefully at how we walk. We know as church leaders, as ministers, as pastors, we're going to be judged more harshly by the people around us, and we're actually held to a higher standard. So we have to do the hard work of taking a look at our life. And I think we could break it down like this. We need to take a look at our life. We need to look at our walk. We need to look at our time. And we need to look at the world, because here's what he says. He says the days are evil. And I think we all know this as leaders, that the world isn't getting any less crazy. People aren't naturally overnight getting less or more and more easy to lead. The days are evil. Our people are dealing with temptations we probably never faced growing up. And we have to take a look at our lives and see if we're making the right use of our time, our energy, our efforts, our resources, our goals, our ideas. We have to take a look at our life, and the days are evil. So he says to stop and reflect. And then in light of those reflections, he says basically, rebuild the rules for your life. And then he gives some rules. And I always thought this was kind of we used to make fun of this passage like in high school. Like we wouldn't really make fun of the passage, but we would kind of make light of it. So we sang spiritual songs to one another, and we were like, what does that even mean? Like, it's kind of like that greet each other with a holy kiss. It was kind of like, oh, this feels like a little out of context to our world. But think about what he's saying. He's saying, I want you to put in place some ways, some rules, some methods, some practices for how you live. He says, don't be foolish. Understand God's will. Be filled with the Spirit, not wine. I know there's some leaders out there. You might need to hear that today. Encourage one another. Worship the Lord. Submit to each other. And he is teaching the same idea that you and I need as well. We have to stop and reflect. We have to look at our life. And in light of those reflections, we have to rebuild. So as leaders, you must retreat before you advance. You must reflect before you rebuild. And you must reset before you restart. And I get it. Most of us leaders are people of vision. We're people of goals. We're people of ideas. And we want to create a better outcome for the future. But like an athlete, we must discipline ourselves to look backwards before we look forwards to progress. See, reflection is not an add-on to your leadership. It's the foundation that informs the direction of your leadership. You don't even know where to go and what to do unless you reflect on the place and the places that God has led you to before. So here's my bottom line for today's podcast, and this is where I really want to challenge you today. My bottom line is this. You must know yourself to lead yourself so that you can lead beyond yourself. Let me say that again. You must know yourself to lead yourself so that you can lead beyond yourself. See, you and I want to make an impact. You and I want to make a difference. You and I want to make disciples, but you cannot lead beyond yourself until you first learn how to lead yourself. So the question then becomes, how do you do this? How do you and I strategically lead ourselves in 2024? So here's an essential leadership system that I think that you need, okay? And this is why I recorded this podcast today, okay? The essential leadership system that you need is called a rule of life, a rule of life. So throughout centuries, I know this word's kind of got popular, especially in this kind of Dallas Willard, John Mark Comer spiritual formation kind of movement that we're in a part of right now, which has been so good for the church. But this is what's called a rule of life. And so throughout centuries, Christians have created an intentional system for self-leadership by creating this idea of a rule of life. And when we think rules, we often think maybe like 10 Commandments, or maybe we think of like a list of rules and procedures. And that's not really what it is. Think more of a ruler, something that's guiding you, that's directing you, that's showing you how far that you've gone in your walk with Jesus. And so Pete Scazzaro, he defines a rule of life. He's all about the emotional, healthy spirituality. I've been going through Emotionally Healthy Leader with some guys right now. It's been so good. But he defines a rule of life like this. He says a rule of life is an intentional, conscious plan to keep God at the center of everything we do. Now, we all want to live a life where God's at the center of everything we do, right? Like, I think every one of us wants that. But what he says is you need an intentional, conscious plan or a system to keep God at the center of everything we do. It's the starting point and the foundation of any rule of life is desire to be with God and to love him. So do you have an intentional plan to keep God at the center of everything that you do? Do you have a system in place to make it successful? And does it actually work? John Mark Comer, he describes a rule of life as this. He says, a rule of life is a schedule and set of practices and relational rhythms that help us create space in our busy world to be with Jesus, to become like Jesus, and to do what he did, and to live life to the fullest, as John 10:10 says, in his kingdom, in alignment with our deepest passions and priorities. So you and I need a rule of life as the self-leadership system that guides us as we guide others. And so over the past few years, I've learned that many people want this idea of a rule of life, but they just don't know how to make one. There's usually not a template to go by. And so here's what I've done. I've created a 4-step process called the year-end reset. And each year, so what I do is I set aside time. I usually like to do it in December in between Christmas and New Year's, but I set aside time to reevaluate, to set goals, and intentionally make plans for the upcoming year. And I can honestly say it has become one of the most transformational yet simple practices in my life. The practice started in high school, and it was kind of when my dad challenged me to set some low goals, middle goals, and high goals. And over time, this has really developed into a full-fledged, holistic rule of life. So since the process has been so helpful to me, I wanted to share it with you. And what I've done is I've created a resource just for our leadership community. And it is called the Year-End Reset, and it's a digital rule of life journal. And it's actually a journal where you're going to be able to build your rule of life for your new year. And you can edit it. There's prompts, there's ways for you to reflect, there's ways for you to put in place some different small and simple systems in your life. There's all kinds of great things that we've built into this digital rule of life journey to help you as you try to lead yourself in a new year. And so I'm going to reference that from here on out. It's called the Year-End Reset, but you can get that in the show notes today. You can also go to simplystrategicministry.com/content. And you can download that there. It is completely editable, completely free, and I want you to take advantage of that. And we hope that really each person who journeys through this will build a more God-centered life, and hopefully will be able to grow their ministry because they're growing as a leader. And so I break the Year-End Reset, and I think this is something that you should do as a leader, into 4 different parts. And so these are 4 parts that I really believe that you as a leader should be doing to strategically lead yourself and to build that rule of life. So let me tell you about the 4 parts. So step 1 of building your rule of life is to retreat to hear from God. Now, I love this quote from Joy Dawson that says, "Anything not born in prayer is born in pride." Man, isn't that so good? How many times have I went out on a new goal, a new vision, a new idea without ever really taking time to deeply pray through that to see if it is God's will? So I believe that's true for any idea that you have, but I also believe that's true for your new year as well, meaning that if your year is not born in prayer, it's ultimately going to be born in pride, and you're going to produce things out of your own deformation. And so I'm sure you agree, but I want to walk more deeply in the Spirit in the upcoming year. I really want to do that. I want to walk less in my own prideful strength. I want to love Jesus more on an intimate level. I want to follow the Father's will more courageously. But those things don't just happen. Those things don't just happen over time. What I've learned is that those things have to be intentionally set up, that in order to grow, I need to intentionally set aside time to retreat, to hear from God so that I can advance my life for God. So in December, I spend that intentional time evaluating and rebuilding my self-leadership system for the new year. And some years I may set aside a day or so, or maybe even I can get away or get to the mountains for a few days. But some years it's just I got to wake up a few hours early every single morning because the kids are crazy and life is crazy. But I think you do need to retreat. And so here's what I want to challenge you to do. First thing I want to challenge you to do is find some blank space. Sadly, most people live at a hectic pace. And unfortunately, the pace often doesn't slow down in December or January due to the holidays, restarting the ministry year, New Year, and that's kind of a big attended season in church world. And so whether you do a retreat in December or January, I want you to find some blank or blank-ish space on the calendar to intentionally spend time in prayer. Now, remember, I have 3 small children. Therefore, finding a weekend or even a night to get away to pray isn't always feasible in your stage of life, and I get that. And but you still need to retreat. So maybe you just block out some of your ministry day. Maybe you block out a morning. Maybe you block out a couple of mornings, or again, maybe you wake up and do 5 a.m. to 7 a.m. For a few days in a row. But you need some blank space that's uninterrupted to set aside that time for God. The second thing I want to challenge you to do is to hang up and hang out with God. So have you ever heard of that term, like hang up and hang out? Like that's something that we've kind of institutionalized in my family when we're on our phones too much. Like hang up, hang out, be with family. And so you're going to want to do the same thing with your retreat. You're going to want to delete your social media apps for a few days. You're going to want to activate your email away message. You're going to want to delegate responsibilities. And you're probably going to turn your phone on airplane mode. Like you need to get away. And then I want to challenge you to process before progress. So while you retreat, I suggest that you spend time with God to confess sin, process the sin in your life, read His Word, ask Him to give you a vision, maybe take communion, maybe confess with a trusted counselor, a coach, or a friend, and invite the Holy Spirit into this process. Because you will not make progress until you actually stop and process what the Lord's doing in your life right now. And so after you've had time to breathe, unwind, and hear from the Lord, then move to step 2. Now, step 2 is this. I want to challenge you. So number 1, we've retreated to hear from God. Number 2 is I want to challenge you to reflect on the previous year. Reflect on the previous year. Here's what I know. You need to relearn your lessons. And here's what I mean. I'm sure you've learned a lot in the past year. And wouldn't it be a shame to forget all of those great lessons? Wouldn't it be awful if the key takeaways was lost in the abyss of your brain? So that's why I'm such a strong believer in relearning lessons. And this is something that's not even just like a spiritual component, but like Harvard Business Review writes about this on reflection. And they actually say that reflection is a key for sustained growth. Here's what they say in the Harvard Business Review. It says this: reflection is an intentional attempt to synthesize abstract and articulate key lessons taught by experience. Therefore, if we want to use the lessons we've learned in our everyday lives, we need to distill that information down into key takeaways. Because the truth of the matter is, if you want to get better in your future, you must spend time reflecting on the things that you do in the present. So, for example, Harvard Business Review found that applied reflection on your experiences was the number 1 indicator of someone who is improving in their field. Here's some reasons why. They say that reflecting on what we've done teaches us to do it more effectively the next time around. It says reflecting on learning the experiences, or reflecting on learning makes the experiences more productive. Reflection builds one's confidence in the ability to achieve a goal, which in turn translates into higher rates of learning. So reflection, meditation, and prayerful processing with the Holy Spirit are essential practices for those who want to grow in godliness. So before you set your vision for the upcoming year, take some time to reflect on the previous year. Now, here's a few exercises I do as I'm reflecting in my retreat. As I retreat, I pray, I confess sin, and then I begin to reflect on these things. And so one of the first things I do is I do quarterly summaries. And so I kind of break up my year into 4 quarters, and I look at, kind of January to March, April to June, July to August, September to December. And what I do is I look at those quarters, and then I list out my wins, I list out my losses, and I kind of try to summarize it into one word, and then I just kind of journal about it. I do that for every single one of those quarters. And that kind of helps me reevaluate the things that happened, helps me kind of bring up memories. Like if you're looking back at February and you're sitting in December, like that, those lessons are pretty far in the past. And so bringing those back up and looking at the wins, looking at the losses really helps me think through my year. The next thing I do is I take and I look at all my wins and accomplishments, and I like to categorize them. And my categories that I use, and again, all of this is in the year-end reset, which you can get in the show notes. I look at self-leadership wins, financial wins, spiritual wins, family wins, health wins, career wins, and ministry wins. And I write those things out. But then I also do the same thing with the losses, the mistakes, and the lessons learned. So I'm looking at the self-leadership losses. I'm looking at my health losses. I'm looking at my financial losses. And I'm going back through and I'm looking at the wins, and I'm also looking at the losses. I do a great job of looking at my wins. It's hard to stop and remember the things I failed at, but we got to do it. Reflection's key for sustained growth. And then the next thing I do is I go through what's called my annual review. And I go and I kind of give each area that I've listed, like self-leadership, financial, spiritual, family, all that. I kind of give myself a score based upon some categories. In our year-end reset document, we have those categories listed out for you. I'd love for you to take a look at them. And then from there, what we're doing is I'm going through, and this process here, this exercise is kind of painful because you've looked at your wins, you looked at your losses. That's kind of bullet point work. But then you're going to go through and you're going to look at some reflection questions. And I want you to stop and really think through these and journal. And so I've created these prompts for you in the year in reset, but you're going to ask yourself, what are some ways you see the Lord working in your life? Or when was your lowest point in the last year? Or who is someone that may have hurt you and sinned against you? And how are you healing from that? This is a question that gets me every year. In what ways do you feel like a fraud? I mean, these are just like gut level, super honest questions that hopefully are going to trigger some thoughts and hopefully draw you into Jesus' presence. So what is your biggest temptation to sin? What's the most challenging moment that you had where afterwards you experienced personal growth? What's one new thing you learned about yourself this past year? I mean, these are things that, man, if you'll take the time to reflect, I believe God will use them to help you kind of reset so that you can rebuild your new year. And then from that, I've taken all of this information down and I'm now distilling takeaways and big lessons. And so I like to take everything I've learned in the past year and boil it down to 5 to 10 lessons. And this for me kind of like, I'm a preacher, so I'm thinking bottom lines here. But this kind of helps me even think through what are some of the things I want to teach in the upcoming year. Like, what are some of the lessons like God's taught me in this past year? How can I use this in the life of my ministry? How can I turn this into content? How can I turn this into a Bible study? And so I'm taking and I'm using what's called exercise 6, which is distill takeaways and big lessons. And then finally, after my reflection, I start looking ahead. So those are the first 2 steps. And I look ahead and that's where I begin to, I try to get to a word. Now, I don't claim to be a prophet, where I'm getting some prophetic word from God where he's going to, I don't know, bring about miracles in my life or, but I'm just trying to get like some vision of like, Holy Spirit, where are you leading me this year? And so like, for example, my word for this year was build. I want to build a healthy culture. I want to build disciples, a healthy family culture. I want to build disciples. I want to build the local church. I believe that's the season God has me in. And that kind of becomes the theme for my year. But I can only get to that theme if I have processed and reflected on the previous year. So this is all a part of what's called the year-end reset. Now, that's the first 2 steps from our process called the year-end reset. And all of this, again, is in the digital Rule of Life journal that we've created for you entirely for free. Now, there's 2 other steps as well, and there's 2 other steps as well, and they are the rebuild phase and the review phase. And this is where you actually begin to build those systems for your life. And so we're going to hit that in the next episode. But I want to challenge you before as soon as you listen to this, go to the show notes, go to our website and download the digital Rule of Life journal called the Year in Reset and begin building out this self-leadership system. Find some time to retreat, find some time to get away and actually reflect. And so you can get this for free at simplystrategicministry.com/content. And you can access this resource and more. And maybe you'd even like to take this even a step further and get some like one-on-one coaching to help you think through this and help you actually build out some goals and build out some systems and your rule of life. Our team would love to see how we can help you do that and add value to your leadership. And you can sign up for that by going to, we do an entirely free coaching session called at simplystrategicministry.com/coaching. You can get that entirely free strategy session with us. And I really think whether you're just using the journal or maybe you're getting coaching, I think if you'll invest the time, you're going to see some really big gains in your leadership this year. And I do believe that this will help you grow your ministry through those simple strategies of like a rule of life and scalable systems like the year-end reset. And so, as always, thank you so much. I can't wait to jump into part 2 with you here very soon as we talk about rebuilding and reviewing. And as always, thank you so much for listening to the Simply Strategic Ministry podcast. If this added value to your leadership, please like, please subscribe, leave a comment, a rating, do all the things, please, so that we can help others think strategically as well. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you back for part 2.